Imagine the darkness of midnight, not just the absence of light, but the weight of fear pressing against your chest. Imagine running barefoot through the woods, not for yourself, but with a child clinging to your heartbeat. Every breath too loud, every step too heavy. And behind you, men with dogs, with guns, with chains. They are not just hunting a runaway. They are hunting you. And if you are caught, your child will never know freedom. This is the story of Clara, a mother who outsmarted hunters in 1859 and changed everything. Imagine silence so heavy it feels like it has weight. A silence where even the rustle of leaves feels like betrayal. The year is 1859, and in the swamps of the American South, a mother clutches her child to her chest. Her arms tremble, not from weakness, but from the impossible responsibility she carries. If the baby cries, death is certain. If her foot slips on the wet ground, the hunters will hear. Somewhere in the distance, dogs sniff the air and men with torches cut the darkness into jagged pieces. This is not a story of war generals or kings. This is not the tale of men who wrote their names into history books. This is the story of Clara, a mother enslaved, a woman unseen, and yet, on this night, she will become unforgettable. Because tonight, she is not just running from chains. Tonight, she is outsmarting the hunters who live to catch her. Why does this story matter? Because Clara's story is not just about her. It is about what every human being fears, the feeling of being hunted. The primal terror of knowing that someone stronger, armed, and merciless is behind you. But Clara had something the hunters did not, a mother's will, sharper than any weapon, more unyielding than any chain. When you hear her story, you will feel the damp earth under her feet. You will hear the dogs growling in the night. And you will understand the cruel genius of the system she fought against, a system that trained men to believe they had the right to own her, to hunt her, to destroy her spirit. In 1859, America was a nation boiling with contradictions. The Declaration of Independence had been signed almost a century earlier, declaring that all men are created equal. And yet, millions were shackled in fields, whipped into submission, and bought and sold like livestock. Clara was one of them. Her days were measured not by hours of freedom, but by the rising and setting of a sun that witnessed her chains. The plantations were ruled by fear. Overseers with whips patrolled the rows of cotton and tobacco. Masters lived in their mansions, building wealth on backs that bled. And beyond the fields, patrols of armed men, called slave catchers, roamed the roads, ensuring no one could slip into freedom. To run was not just an act of desperation. It was an act of war. Clara was not famous. She left no diary, no speeches, no letters. History rarely remembered women like her. But on this night, history bent in her direction. She was a mother, her child no more than 2 years old. She had lived her life under commands, her body and choices not her own. But motherhood had carved something into her spirit, a promise that her child would not grow up under the same lash. And so, when whispers of escape reached her ears, when someone told her of a way north, a hidden path through swamps and forests, a road that led to freedom, she decided she would take it, even if it meant death. Because slavery had already been a kind of death, and anything beyond it, even a dangerous midnight run, was worth the risk. Picture it, the night is damp, clouds heavy with the threat of rain. Clara waits until the overseers sleep, until the last lanterns are extinguished. She wraps her child in cloth, not just to keep warm, but to silence every whimper, every cry. She whispers to her baby, a lullaby without melody, a prayer without words. Then she steps into the night. Behind her, a system that demanded her obedience. Ahead of her, a wilderness filled with danger. And somewhere in between, men with dogs, trained to hunt her like prey. The hunters had everything on their side: weapons, dogs, horses, and the law. Clara had only the shadows, her memory of whispered directions, and a will stronger than chains. Now ask yourself, what would you do? Could you run through the dark, every branch a threat, every sound a warning, with a child's tiny heartbeat pressed against your chest? Could you silence your own fear when fear itself could give you away? And in doing so, she became more than a runaway. She became a symbol of defiance, a reminder that the human spirit, once ignited, can outwit even the most merciless hunters. This is Clara's story, but to understand her midnight run, you must first understand the world she lived in. A world designed to break her, to erase her, and yet, a world she would ultimately defy. The year was 1859. America stood on the edge of fire. Within 2 years, the nation would tear itself apart in a civil war. But on plantations across the South, that war already raged silently, every day, in the lives of enslaved men, women, and children. The soil was rich. Cotton grew tall, tobacco leaves spread wide, rice swamps glistened under the sun. But that wealth came at a price. Human lives, measured not in years, but in lashes of the whip, in fields worked from dawn until stars reappeared. For Clara, slavery was not an idea or a law written in books. It was the sound of chains dragging through dirt. It was the smell of sweat in the fields, of blood on the overseer's whip. It was the feeling of being owned body, mind, and future. Every plantation had its rulers, and none were more feared than the overseers. They were men who measured their power in scars they left behind. With whips braided from rawhide, they patrolled the fields, their eyes searching for weakness, for any pause in work that could be punished. A single lash was agony. 10 lashes left scars for life. Some endured 100, tied to posts while others were forced to watch, a lesson carved into flesh, a warning that freedom was not theirs to seek. And yet, punishment was not only physical. It was psychological. Overseers knew how to break people not just with pain, but with fear. They tore families apart, sold children away from mothers, forced men to stand helpless as their wives were abused. This was Clara's world. A world where even love became dangerous, because at any moment it could be stolen. Beyond the plantation walls, freedom seemed close. The North was hundreds of miles away, but each mile was a battle. Slave patrols roamed the countryside, armed men on horseback, sworn to hunt down anyone daring to run. They carried guns, chains, and dogs trained to track human scent. To escape meant outsmarting not only men, but animals bred for the chase. Bloodhounds could follow a trail through swamps, across rivers, through forests. Once loosed, they rarely stopped until they found their prey. And if you were caught, capture did not mean simple return. It meant torture. Whippings until flesh tore open. Branding with hot irons. Sometimes even death, to serve as an example to others. The hunters of men were not just enforcers of law. They were businessmen. Every runaway captured was money earned. And to them, Clara was not a mother. She was not a woman. She was property. In 1850, Congress had passed the Fugitive Slave Act. This law gave hunters even more power. Even if Clara reached the so-called free states of the North, she was not safe. Slave catchers could cross into those states, seize her, and drag her back south, all under protection of federal law. Neighbors were encouraged to report runaways. Officials were paid to assist in their capture. To resist was to risk fines, even jail. The law was clear. Clara did not belong to herself. She belonged to her master. Her child belonged to her master. Her body, her labor, her very breath, all were claimed by another. And yet, laws, no matter how cruel, cannot chain the will to be free. Slavery did not only chain the body. It sought to chain the mind. From childhood, the enslaved were told they were inferior, incapable, destined to serve. Songs, sermons, and stories were twisted by masters to convince them that obedience was divine will. But in whispers, hidden away from watchful ears, another truth lived. Songs of freedom passed through fields. Bible verses reinterpreted as promises of deliverance. Stories of those who had escaped, legends of the Underground Railroad, where strangers risked their lives to guide the hunted North. These whispers kept hope alive. And hope was dangerous. Because once the mind imagined freedom, the body began to yearn for it. Clara had heard those whispers. She had held onto them, storing them like precious fire inside her chest. In 1859, Nat Turner's rebellion was still a memory whispered with terror. 2 decades earlier, Turner, an enslaved preacher, had led a violent uprising in Virginia. Dozens of whites were killed before it was suppressed, and in its aftermath, the South's iron grip tightened. Laws became harsher, punishments more brutal. Fear spread on both sides, fear of rebellion, fear of capture. For mothers like Clara, the fear was doubled. To run was to risk not just her life, but her child's. And yet, to stay was to guarantee her child's chains. Plantation owners justified slavery as necessary. They called it an institution. They dressed it in false kindness, speaking of taking care of those they enslaved. But the reality was cold math. Each person was a line in an account book. A woman was not just a worker, she was also breeding stock. Her children were future profit, born already enslaved. Clara knew this. She had seen children ripped from mothers, sold like cattle. She had felt the weight of being counted not as human, but as property. This knowledge shaped her decision. Running was not just for herself. It was for the child in her arms, whose entire future hung in the balance. By 1859, the air itself felt electric with resistance. Underground networks grew stronger. Safe houses dotted the North, operated by abolitionists who risked prison to help. Famous names like Harriet Tubman led dozens to freedom, becoming living legends. But most stories were never told. Most names were never written. For every Harriet Tubman, there were hundreds of Claras, unnamed, unrecorded, but just as brave. This was the world Clara stepped into. A world where everything told her she was powerless. And yet, in the shadows, in the silence of midnight, she chose to fight back the only way she could, by running. Now that you understand Clara's world, the overseers, the hunters, the laws, the chains, you will see her choice in its true light. It was not madness. It was not recklessness. It was courage carved out of desperation. In the next chapter, we step closer to Clara herself, into her life, her heart, her decision. The woman behind the midnight run. Clara was not born free. From the first breath she took, the world told her who she was. Property. Her earliest memories were not of toys or lullabies, but of commands shouted, of hands pulling her to work, of other children around her carrying buckets too heavy for their small bodies. She belonged to a plantation in Georgia, a place where fields stretched so wide that the horizon swallowed them whole. The house of the master loomed in the distance, grand, white columns gleaming in the sun, while the slave quarters sagged, wooden huts cramped and cold. From childhood, Clara learned silence. Silence kept you alive. Words could be dangerous, questions could invite punishment, laughter could draw suspicion. So she worked with her head down, hands moving fast, eyes lowered. But inside, Clara's spirit was not silent. She listened. She watched. She stored away every scrap of knowledge, the paths through the woods, the sound of patrol dogs, the stories whispered by older women at night. When she grew older, her labor grew harder. Days in the fields bent her back, burned her skin. Nights were filled with exhaustion. But Clara carried something no overseer could see, a quiet defiance, an ember that refused to die. Clara's greatest act of resistance was not in running, not yet. It was in loving. To love in slavery was to risk heartbreak. Children were bought, sold, traded. Husbands and wives separated. But Clara loved anyway. Her child, a boy barely 2 years old, was her anchor. His laugh was her reminder that joy could still live, even in chains. His tiny hands gripping her fingers gave her strength when lashes and hunger drained her body. She looked at him and saw not a slave, but a future. And that thought alone planted rebellion in her heart. The chance came quietly. A whisper from another enslaved man, one who had tried to escape before and failed. He spoke of swamps that led north, of routes hidden by night, of safe houses where strangers waited to help. Not all make it, he warned. Dogs catch most. Some starve. Some freeze. But a few touch freedom. Clara's heart burned. She weighed the risks. To stay was to watch her child grow under the same whip, the same chains. To run was to gamble both their lives. For weeks, she prayed silently. She rehearsed in her mind every step, every sound, every possibility. She prepared cloth to wrap her child, food she could hide, water she could carry. And one night, when the air was thick and the overseers had drunk themselves into sleep, Clara made her choice. She would run. And so, the stage was set. A mother's heart against the hunter's hounds. A desperate gamble against an empire built on fear. In the next chapter, we follow Clara into the shadows as the midnight run begins. Midnight. The plantation sleeps. Clara's heart pounds louder than her footsteps. Her child breathes against her chest, wrapped tightly in cloth. The air is heavy with mist, the sky a blanket of black. She moves silently, each step calculated, every sound a threat. Behind her lies the only life she has ever known. Ahead, the unknown, a wilderness that could kill her as easily as it could free her. She avoids the main roads, slipping through tall grass, crossing fields where moonlight betrays her shape. Every rustle of leaves feels like a shout. Every snapping twig a signal to the hunters. And then, the dogs. Far away at first, barking, baying. Her blood runs cold. They've noticed. They're coming. She runs faster, not daring to breathe. She presses her child's head into her chest, whispering prayers without words. The swamp waits ahead, dark, wet, filled with snakes and biting insects. But it also hides her trail. Clara plunges into the water, mud sucking at her feet, the stench of decay filling her nose. She forces herself forward, step by agonizing step. The dogs arrive at the water's edge, barking furiously, but the trail is broken. The swamp swallows her footprints. Still, the hunters will not give up. The chase has begun. The hunters are relentless, the night endless. But Clara has more than fear on her side. She has intelligence. She has instinct. She has the will of a mother. The hunters were not men chasing animals. They were men chasing profit. Each runaway was worth money, and Clara was worth plenty. A young woman, strong, with a child who would grow into a worker, she was a walking investment. The hounds were trained to kill. Muscled, sharp-nosed, relentless, they could follow the faintest trace of sweat through woods and rivers. Once unleashed, they would not stop until commanded. The hunters lit their torches, their voices echoing in the dark. Find her. Don't let her slip. The swamp became a battleground. Clara doubled back, wading deeper, confusing the dogs. She crawled beneath roots, smeared mud over her skin to hide her scent. Her mind raced, every trick she had ever heard now her only hope. Hours passed. The hunters cursed, their torches flickering. The hounds howled, but found nothing. Clara had bought herself time. But time was not enough. She was still deep in enemy land, her child growing heavier with each step, her body aching. Ahead, more dangers waited. And the hunters had not given up. The night wore on. Clara moved silently, but exhaustion dragged at her. Her child stirred, threatening to cry. She pressed him close, heart hammering, as torches passed within feet of her hiding place. One hunter stopped, sniffing the air, listening. His dog barked wildly, pulling at its chain. Clara froze, holding her breath until her lungs burned. Then thunder cracked across the sky. Rain began to fall, pounding on leaves, drowning out the sound of her heartbeat. The hunters cursed, their torches sputtering. The rain washed her trail away. Clara slipped deeper into the darkness, saved by the storm. But storms do not last forever. And Clara's journey was far from over. Hours turned to days. Clara hid by day, moved by night. She survived on scraps, on roots, on water scooped from muddy streams. Her child weakened, but she whispered songs into his ears, keeping him calm. Finally, a light in the distance. Not a torch, but a lantern swinging slowly, a signal. She had found what so many prayed to find, the Underground Railroad. A stranger opened a barn door, pulling her inside. White and black, men and women, abolitionists risked everything to guide people like Clara north. They gave her food, shelter, whispered encouragement. But danger still lurked. The Fugitive Slave Act meant hunters could storm into any home, drag her back south. Freedom was still far away. And so, Clara pressed on. Each step north was a victory, but also a risk. Her story was not yet safe. Weeks later, after endless nights of walking, hiding, starving, Clara crossed into free soil. The hunters were behind her. The hounds silenced. She fell to her knees, child still in her arms, tears mixing with mud. For the first time in her life, no one owned her. For the first time, her child's future was not written in chains. Clara was free. Clara's name did not make it into history books. But her story lived on in whispers, in songs, in the memory of those she inspired. Her midnight run was more than survival. It was defiance. It was proof that, even against overwhelming odds, the human spirit can rise. And perhaps that is why her story matters most today. Because Clara was not famous. She was ordinary. And yet, in her ordinary courage, she became extraordinary. Imagine the silence of that night once more. The dogs barking, the hunter shouting, the storm breaking overhead, and a mother clutching her child, refusing to surrender. Clara's run was not just a story of the past. It is a reminder that freedom is never given, it is fought for. That hope can survive even in chains. And that sometimes, the greatest warriors are not soldiers with guns, but mothers with children in their arms.